Hi. In this series of lectures, we'll look at the digestive system, and I've broken it up into 8 short little pieces, some of them only 2 or 3 slides, rather than combining it into larger ones. We'll see how it works. Give me some feedback if you prefer short or long videos. So, the digestive system. And so this is an overview picture, two images side by side, more or less the same. Some things are shown on one that aren't on the other, but you should know pretty much all of this anatomy that's shown in these 2 slides. So let's run through the slide together on the right. Showing the alimentary canal, this digestive system, and salivary glands. There are 3 of them. We'll go through these in a little more detail later, but this is an introduction to the whole system. You can think of it as the alimentary canal, which is just a tube from the oral cavity, from the mouth, all the way through to the anus. And the food passes through there, it's processed, digested, and some of it's absorbed and some of it's excreted. So several sets of salivary glands. They're the parotid, which are the largest. We'll see those again later. The submandibular, below the mandible, and the sublingual, below the tongue. And the pharynx, and you remember the 3 sections of the pharynx. We had the nasopharynx, and then we had the oropharynx, and then we had the laryngopharynx. And then the esophagus. This is a slide from the British. They spell esophagus with an O in front of it. Don't worry about it. For us, it's just ESO. And then the stomach and the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Along the way are several accessory structures of the digestive system, including the salivary glands. The liver is considered a sort of a second or accessory structure. There's the gallbladder and a little blue bile duct that we'll take a look at later. And then the small intestine, several sections to that we'll look at. That then drains into the large intestine. And there are 3 sections of it. There's an ascending colon, a transverse colon, a descending colon, and then a sigmoid colon, which is just sort of S-shaped. And we'll take a look at those. Cecum, appendix, pancreas. So that's an overview. On the left, shows an upper esophageal sphincter. Don't really talk about that very much. It's not very strong. It's even weaker than the lower gastroesophageal sphincter, draining it into the stomach. So again, the pancreas and the gallbladder are shown on the left. The ileocecal valve is shown, which isn't shown on the other side. So, good introduction. So I want to spend a little bit of time on the muscles of mastication, of chewing. So digestion begins in the mouth, and we can think of digestion in terms of both mechanical, which is just grinding, chewing, macerating the food, and then chemical, which involves enzymes and hydrolysis of covalent bonds, which little of that occurs in the mouth. So with mechanical digestion or chewing, there are several sets of muscles. You should have seen these in A&P 1. But these are the muscles of mastication. Here are 3 of them, and these are, for the most part, elevators. They elevate the mandible. So you should remember the temporalis, which is a large sort of fan-shaped muscle. on the temporal region of the head. Now all these, the temporalis originates on the skull and it inserts on the mandible on that coronoid process. That, if you remember, here's the condyle of the mandible, and this is a sort of a sketch of the mandible underneath. There's this process, and then it kind of comes down onto the rest of the mandible. So, and then here's the other part of the mandible. So the temporalis muscle has multiple fibers, of course, and when these fibers, sort of in the anterior end, contract, they just get shorter, and they lift the condyle of the mandible, they elevate it. And that raises the entire mandible upward. So all of these muscles that are elevators, that's their action. But I put in here also that the temporalis is involved with retraction. So some of these other muscle fibers, these posterior fibers, are running in this direction. And they're still inserting on this coronoid process of the mandible. And when those muscle fibers contract, they pull the mandible backward in reverse. So they're involved with retraction of the mandible. There are other muscles that we'll take a look at that move the mandible forward for protrusion, but the temporalis both elevates and retracts. It's the only one that assists with retraction of the mandible. The masseter, we've seen this one before. It's on the lateral outer surface of the angle and the ramus of the mandible. It's a strong elevator. And then this may be a new one for you if you didn't do this one in ANP1, but it's the medial pterygoids. And the medial pterygoid, one on each side, right and left, and it's similar to the masseter, and it inserts on the medial surface of the mandible on the angle, so it's inserting down here on the medial surface. And it also is an elevator. So when it shortens, it lifts the mandible or elevates it. But it's much weaker in elevation than the masseter. The final slide or picture or muscle in these of mastication are the lateral pterygoids. So you just finished in the previous slide with the medial pterygoids. These are the lateral pterygoids, right and left. And they are deep. If you look at the top figure in this slide, you can't see it because the temporalis, the masseter, the zygomatic arch are all over it. But if you remove all of that, deep underneath is the lateral pterygoid muscle. There are two heads to it. We won't worry about that. But that's the lateral pterygoid. And it's involved with side-to-side movement. So when you shift your mandible right or left during chewing, or when you jut your mandible forward and protrude your jaw, that's the action of the lateral pterygoids. A couple of notes. All of these muscles of mastication insert somewhere on the mandible. So for example, the lateral pterygoids are inserting near the condyle. That's where they insert. And the medial pterygoid, we just had drawn on the other side, on the other slide, on the medial surface. And then we talked about the temporalis and the masseter. So all those muscles are inserting on the mandible somewhere. So that's easy. And none of these muscles of mastication are considered depressors. So none of them are going to lower the mandible. That's another group of muscles. The muscles of mastication are considered those that are basically moving the mandible upward and side to side. So the next slide looks at the action of the lateral pterygoids. because I would like you to understand how they shift the mandible left to right and protrude it. So this is a view. It's superior view. You're looking straight down on the mandible, and here are the condyles. This is not necessarily anatomically correct because I'm not an artist. This is the best I could do. So there are the condyles, and here is the mandibular fossa, which is part of the temporal bone, and that forms the TMJ. The temporal bone and the mandible, temporomandibular joint. So there's a joint right and left, and then here are the lateral pterygoids, and they are originating on what's referred to as the pterygoid processes of the sphenoid bone. Don't need to worry about those right now. Just appreciate that these muscles run more or less laterally from their origin to their point of insertion. And remember, the insertion is what's going to be moving, which is the mandible. So those are the lateral pterygoid muscles. Okay. So what I wanted to show was what the action is with bilateral contraction. So with bilateral contraction, you have both muscles contracting together at the same time. So I drew little green arrows here on the lateral pterygoids to show that these muscles are shortening, and as they shorten, they move the mandible, they pull the mandible anteriorly out of that fossa on the temporal bone. So again, here was the fossa that the condyle was sitting in, and as the lateral pterygoids contract and pull on the condyles, they move it forward and the jaw protrudes. So when you jut your jaw forward, that's due to bilateral contraction of the lateral pterygoids. Okay. This slide is copied from the previous one. So what happens if we have unilateral contraction? And unilateral is where just one side contracts. So let's say if we contract just the right lateral pterygoid. So that would be this one with the green dot. So if that one shortens, contracts, it'll pull this mandible or this condyle forward. So that's shown in the next slide. So what happens, again, we have only the right lateral pterygoid contracting. So this is unilateral contracting. The left one is not doing anything. And so it pivots. On the left, this condyle isn't going anywhere. It stays in the fossa of the temporal bone. And as the right lateral contracts and gets shorter, this muscle gets shorter as it moves to its, shortens toward the origin. It again pulls the right lateral, or the right condyle out of the fossa, and the entire jaw shifts to the left. And the opposite would happen to shift it to the right. You would contract the left lateral pterygoid. And the condyle glides in that TMJ joint cavity. So that's enough of the muscles of mastication and the action of the lateral pterygoids. So I'm going to stop with the previous slide. So we'll stop here.